should mention, I'm just about to mark my 7-year anniversary as Director of Communications for the Marijuana Policy Project. Before that, I was a freelance reporter for a dozen years, much like Ann. I sometimes refer to myself as a recovering journalist. And what I'm here to tell you today, I think we have at this point established definitively that a lot of the coverage of marijuana and marijuana issues sucks. What I'm here now to tell you is that you can in fact change some of it. Not all of it, but you can make a difference with a well-placed, well-crafted complaint. To just give one recent example, a month or two ago, doing my usual morning scan of the marijuana news, and I see a story from a newspaper in Utah about the latest marijuana eradication campaign there. And like so many of these stories, every single source in the story was a government official, almost all law enforcement. And they spouted all sorts of exaggerated, inaccurate, sometimes just flat-out false stuff about marijuana and its effects, etc. Now, this was a smallish paper. I didn't want to invest a whole lot of time in this. But I did write a letter to the editor, and I copied the reporter who wrote the story. And I pointed out a couple of the more glaring inaccuracies and suggested that they could have avoided those if they talked to somebody who might be skeptical about the concept of marijuana eradication, who could also point out the vast array of data that suggests that such campaigns in fact don't work. Well, they did print the letter, and I was feeling fairly happy about that. And then, a few days later, I get a call from a reporter at that very paper. Not the reporter I'd written to, somebody else, who was doing a story about yet another marijuana eradication campaign and wanted to know if I would like to comment on whether these things do any good. As you can imagine, I did. And when the story came out the next day, they gave us about as much space as the cops. They actually did quite a good job of laying out our critique of this whole nonsense. Now, what's interesting to me is this was about a 20-minute investment of my time. At this point, I could write these letters to the editor in my sleep. But clearly, my little letter got passed around their newsroom and talked about, and somebody thought, hey, we can get a little conflict into this story, we should give this guy a call. It can be done. I usually, let me start with a couple of basic guidelines here. Pick your targets carefully. Not every negative story about marijuana is an act of journalistic malfeasance. It is unfortunately true that some people who smoke marijuana or grow it or sell it do stupid, reckless, dangerous things, and those things may legitimately be news. Zero in, if I'm going to actually complain, if I'm going to say you got this wrong, I'm looking for stories that either have significant inaccuracies or significant omissions, something that they left out that's necessary to understand the story. And as Paul pointed out, there's no shortage of those. I generally start with the reporter who actually did the story, rather than going over their head to an editor or whatever. And that's simple common courtesy. If somebody's got a complaint about how you do your job, would you rather they took it up with you or went behind your back to your boss? So I start with the reporter. You can always go above their head if you need to. And it's really important, as hard as it be, no matter how pissed off you may be polite, be respectful. First of all, the problem may not be the reporter's fault. Whether it's TV or radio or newspapers, a lot of hands will be on that story between when the reporter finishes it and when you see or read it. And you don't know what got cut, you don't know what got changed. So what appears as a terrible story may have been much better when the reporter gave it to their editor. And remember that journalists are human. They have feelings. They don't like to be yelled at. Nobody likes to be yelled at. And believe it or not, most of them genuinely believe that they are fair and impartial and accurate even when they aren't. There is bias out there. There is lots of bias out there. But most of it is, in fact, unconscious. And if there's time, I'll give you a couple of examples of conversations where that was really obvious to me. But in any case, yelling or saying, "Ah, you miserable lying government mouthpiece," they're never going to listen to what the concrete part of your complaint, because they're not going to hear it. They will have already turned you out. When I can, and it's not always possible, when I can, I try and take a positive approach. Hey, saw your story about such and such, it was really interesting, but you know, there's a couple of angles to this that you may not be aware of. And then I give them one or two of the juiciest, sexiest facts I can think of that should have been in their story. For example, if the subject is marijuana eradication, which is one of my pet peeves, I point out that every year the U.S. Justice Department publishes a report called the Drug Threat Assessment, the 2008 version of which points out that A, marijuana availability is increasing despite all of these eradication campaigns, and B, and this is, remember, this is the Justice Department, not me, they say that these outdoor eradication campaigns are driving an increase in indoor cultivation, producing higher potency marijuana year-round, causing an exponential increase in the profits of criminal drug trafficking organizations. That's the U.S. Justice Department. I have yet to find a reporter who knows that this document even exists. I try to be specific, factual. I always tell them exactly the sources I'm coming from, and I offer them copies of those sources. Most of the time they're not going to read them. I want them to know I have them. I want them to know that I've done my homework even if they're never going to do theirs. And the idea of all this is to start establishing relationships. You want them not just to fix whatever they screwed up the first time, although you always want them to do that if they can, but you want them to think, hey, the next time I'm doing a marijuana story, I should call these folks. This guy was pretty smart. He seemed to know what he was talking about. And a lot of the time, we're talking about people who really are not familiar at all with our side of the argument. And I have, in fact, established a number of relationships with reporters over the years that started from saying, hey, there was something you missed. But again, it all comes from being respectful of the fact that they're usually trying to do a good job, even when they're not. Now, that said, there are times when you can't take the sort of low-key approach I'm talking about. There are times when you just have to get on the phone and say, hey, you screwed up, this needs to be fixed now, when something is really time-sensitive. For example, a couple years ago, I'm sure you all remember the infamous Supreme Court case, Gonzalez versus Raich, a medical marijuana case that our side lost. And Associated Press, the biggest wire service in the country, hugely important, did a preview story about the possible impact of the ruling right before, a couple days before it came out, in which they erroneously said that this ruling could overturn state medical marijuana laws. That was never a possibility. It was simply wrong. I saw that. I happened to be glancing at Google News and saw it about 5 minutes after I hit the wire, got on the phone. The writer actually was somebody I knew who actually knows better and just screwed up. Got on the phone. I couldn't reach him, but I kept calling until I found somebody in charge. And to their great credit, they got a corrected version out within about an hour, and the screwed up version barely saw the light of day. So again, you can do it. It's a pain in the ass. I wish I didn't have to, but it has become a significant part of my job, and it's really important. Another thing I would say is when you're communicating with the press, we all are tempted to mostly communicate when we're pissed off, and that's absolutely necessary. But give positive feedback too. When they get something right, tell them. Now, don't phrase it, particularly when you're talking to a reporter who wants to generally characterize themselves as being, quote-unquote, objective. Don't say, hey, I'm really glad you're on our side, because that may, in fact, scare them off. But praise them for being accurate, praise them for being fair, praise them for doing their research and looking at both sides of the story, if they actually do. And occasionally they do. How am I doing on time, Richard? Okay, go ahead. I want to then go back, just talk a little bit more about this notion of unconscious bias, and a conversation I had over the summer with a couple of medical